In the early morning hours of November 21, 2025, St. Louis Lambert International Airport was quiet. Most travelers had already departed for the night, and only a few late arrivals moved through Terminal 1. At approximately 12:41 a.m., St. Louis Airport police officers were conducting routine foot patrols through the terminal, a standard security measure to ensure the safety of travelers and staff during the overnight hours. As the officers made their rounds through Terminal 1, they noticed an adult male standing near a restroom entrance. The man appeared to be loitering in the area without any apparent purpose related to travel. Officers approached to assess the situation, a common occurrence in airport terminals where individuals sometimes seek shelter from the elements, especially during cold nights. The officers made contact with the man and instructed him to leave the airport premises. This is standard protocol when someone without legitimate airport business is found lingering in secure areas. The instruction was clear and straightforward. However, instead of complying with this reasonable request, the man refused. What should have been a simple interaction was about to become something far more serious. The man, later identified as 31-year-old Darius Kennedy, reached into the sleeve of his jacket. In one swift motion, he pulled out a knife. The atmosphere changed instantly. What had been a routine encounter now became a critical threat situation. The officers found themselves facing an armed individual in a public space where innocent travelers could be present at any moment. The officers immediately began issuing verbal commands, ordering Kennedy to drop the knife. Their training emphasizes de-escalation and giving individuals every opportunity to comply peacefully. They repeated the commands multiple times, making it absolutely clear what they needed Kennedy to do. Drop the knife. Put down the weapon. These commands were ignored completely. Kennedy not only refused to drop the knife, but began moving toward the officers while still holding the weapon. The threat level escalated dramatically. One of the officers made the decision to deploy a taser, choosing a less lethal option in an attempt to stop Kennedy without causing permanent harm. The taser was fired and made contact with Kennedy, the probe striking him. However, the taser proved ineffective. Whether due to thick clothing, poor probe placement, or Kennedy's physical condition, the electrical charge did not incapacitate him as intended. He remained standing, still armed, still dangerous. Now Kennedy was still holding the knife after being struck by the taser. The less lethal option had failed. The officers had exhausted that avenue of de-escalation. Kennedy then made a decision that would seal his fate. Still armed with the knife, he turned and began running, but he wasn't running away to escape. He was running directly toward another police officer who was positioned nearby. This officer suddenly found himself in immediate danger. An armed subject who had already refused multiple commands, who had ignored warnings, who had not been stopped by a taser, was now charging directly at him with a deadly weapon. The distance was closing rapidly. There was no time for additional de-escalation attempts. There was no time for another less lethal option. The officer had only seconds to respond to a threat that could cost him his life. The officer fired his service weapon. The shot struck Kennedy, finally stopping his forward movement and ending the immediate threat. The entire confrontation, from the initial contact near the restroom to the final shots fired, had lasted only moments. But in those moments, officers had attempted verbal commands, deployed less lethal force, and only resorted to deadly force when directly charged by an armed individual. As soon as Kennedy was down and the threat neutralized, the officers' priorities immediately shifted. They moved to provide medical aid, rendering assistance to the man they had just been forced to shoot. This is standard protocol and reflects the reality that officers don't want these outcomes. They began administering first aid, doing what they could to preserve Kennedy's life. Despite their efforts and the rapid response, Kennedy was pronounced deceased at the scene. The investigation that followed would piece together the full picture of what had occurred in Terminal 1 that night. Detectives responded to process the scene and gather evidence. They recovered the knife that Kennedy had been wielding during the confrontation, physical evidence that corroborated the officer's account of events. The weapon was real, the threat was real, and the danger to the officers had been genuine. Investigators learned more about Darius Kennedy. He was 31 years old and had been experiencing homelessness. This detail provided context for why he may have been in the airport terminal that night. Airports, with their climate control and public access, sometimes become refuge points for individuals without stable housing, especially during harsh weather. But being unhoused doesn't explain or excuse brandishing a weapon at police officers. The official investigation determined that 4 shots total were fired by law enforcement during the incident. Ballistics and forensic evidence would help investigators understand the exact sequence of events. Fortunately, none of the officers involved suffered physical injuries during the confrontation. However, the psychological toll of such incidents on law enforcement personnel can be significant and lasting. Officers involved in shootings often experience stress, trauma, and the weight of having taken a life, even when legally justified. Airport security footage would have captured portions of the incident, providing an objective record of the events as they unfolded. Body camera footage from the officers would also be reviewed as part of the investigation. These recordings would show the commands given, the deployment of the taser, and the final moments when Kennedy charged at the officer with the knife. This incident at St. Louis Lambert International Airport represents a tragic but instructive case study in how rapidly police encounters can escalate. Officers began with a simple request for someone to leave the premises. They attempted verbal de-escalation through multiple commands. They employed less lethal force with the taser. Only when all other options had been exhausted and an officer's life was in immediate danger did they resort to deadly force. The case also highlights the unpredictable nature of police work. Officers conducting routine patrols in what should be a relatively controlled environment like an airport terminal can suddenly find themselves in life-threatening situations. They must be prepared to respond appropriately across a spectrum of possibilities, from providing directions to tourists to defending themselves against armed attacks, sometimes within the span of just a few minutes. For the traveling public, this incident serves as a reminder of the security challenges that exist even in places we consider safe. For law enforcement, it reinforces the importance of training, proper equipment, and sound decision-making under pressure. And for everyone, it stands as a sobering example of how a life can be lost in moments when poor decisions meet legitimate law enforcement authority in a confrontation that no one wanted, but that became unavoidable.